Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled, Can You Join the Military with ADHD? What Hopeful Service Members Need to Know. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Brandi Walker. Dr. Walker is an Army clinical psychologist and faculty member at Womack Army Medical Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. She's also an active duty Army major who works directly with service members and their families. Our webinar today will help guide people with ADHD who are considering a career in the military. We'll explain current recruitment policies, including restrictions around medication use, and we'll discuss the pros and cons of working in a military environment. We'd like to begin today's webinar by asking this poll question to our live audience. What aspects of military life are most appealing to you and/or to your child with ADHD? Please select your answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us more. For answers to common questions about webinar slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance options, click on the FAQ tab of your webinar screen. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast number 457 to access the webinar resources. And if you support the work we're doing here at ADDitude to strengthen the ADHD community, we encourage you to visit ADDitudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine, which is loaded with great advice from experts to help you and your family thrive. Sign up for yourself or to share with a teacher or a loved one who could benefit from greater ADHD understanding. Click the magazine tab on your screen to learn more. Finally, the sponsor of this webinar is Accentrate 110. Accentrate 110 is a dietary supplement formulated to address nutritional deficiencies known to be associated with ADHD. It contains omega-3 fatty acids in phospholipid form, the form already in your brain. This brain-ready nutrition helps manage inattention, lack of focus, emotional dysregulation, and hyperactivity without drug-like side effects. Click the link on screen or visit phoenixhealthscience.com to learn more. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting our webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Brandi Walker. Thank you so much for joining us today and for leading this discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate all that you all do at ADDitude. Very appreciative for the work that Carol and Carly and everybody else does behind the scenes. So thank you for having me. I hope that we can continue the discussion and we'll go ahead and get right into it. So we're going to talk about ADHD in the military. I'm going to tell you what I think you need to know. There may be some other things that you want to add to that, but I'll kind of lay a foundation for you today. So I always have to throw out my DOD disclaimer because the views expressed in this presentation are those of the author, which is me. They do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Army, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government, okay? One of those reasons is why I'm wearing Army green and not my uniform, so that we can make that distinction, okay? I might remind you of that by the time we're done, because we're going to talk about a lot of things. All right, so here's our agenda. I'm going to move kind of quickly because we are going to cover quite a few things. I'll let you know, I'll give you a brief intro on me, and then we'll talk a little bit about the references that kind of govern how the military looks at medical conditions as a whole. And then we'll talk a little bit about military environment, the mission. I'm going to introduce you to H2F if you never heard of H2F before. And then I'll talk about some qualities and traits that thrive in the military. We'll talk about pros and cons and what makes this relationship so complicated. I'll share some policy guidance related observations. We'll talk about some comorbid symptoms and then symptoms that are kind of that happen to come with, military service over time, depending on your job and the things that you're exposed to. And then I want to wrap things up with some coping skills, executive functioning strategies, some tools that could be very effective in helping you navigate the diagnosis regardless, but also particularly in a military environment. Now, here's my introduction. So you see me in uniform, right? And then not in uniform, two different people. Well, I'm the same person, but probably just look really different. You probably wouldn't recognize me if you saw me outside of uniform. But I figured I'd tell you all maybe a little story about my career. So I joined the military when I was 17, and I'm coming from the Chicago metropolitan area. Okay, so if you know anything about the city of Chicago, you know that there's not a lot of woods and forests. Okay, so just stay with me on this. So when I joined, I was like 17, right out of high school. And one of my main reasons for joining was because I didn't have a lot of funding for college. And I knew that the military had scholarships and other opportunities that could help me, acquire a college education. So over the years of my military career, I did acquire education and got, started out getting my associates and then bachelor's and master's and a Ph.D. So the military has been fantastic in many ways, and that is one. So when I first joined, I went to basic training, and I'll just be honest with you. So I've been in the military for probably a couple decades. And throughout all of that time, my most difficult time, the most challenging experience was going through basic training. And when I went through basic training, one of the things we had to do was ruck march. Now, a ruck march is when you put this heavy, heavy backpack on your back and you walk for miles. And so we did a ruck march, and we went out to like this field. And so first of all, they give you a list of things to put in your ruck or your backpack, right? So in my mind, I'm like, okay, I'm just putting everything that's on the list in there. I don't know what I'm going to do. Some of this stuff I've never ever seen before in my life, but it's in my backpack and we're walking, and I'm like, I can't wait to put this heavy thing down. I'm just being honest with you. So maybe we go for about 4 or 5 miles. And eventually we get to a spot. And then so by that time, it's like maybe 4 or 5 in the evening, 4 or 5 in the afternoon, getting towards the evening. And this is in South Carolina. And so my drill sergeant says, hey, go ahead and unpack and, put up your tent. And I was like, now I know in my backpack, I packed a bunch of stuff, but I don't think I packed a tent. I was like, maybe I'm missing something. So I'm asking around, like, you got a tent? You got a tent? And the drill sergeant overhears me. He's like, Private, you got a tent in your backpack? And I'm like, I do. So I'm looking, and then he pulls it out. And it's like a sheet of, it looks like heavy fabric. I was like, how is this a tent? And so he said, Private, you get a battle buddy. It's called a shelter half, right? So you get a battle buddy and you guys put your 2 pieces together and it's a tent, right? Now, okay, so that's lesson 1. Lesson 2 is like, now I got to put this thing with stakes and hammer them in the ground and all this other stuff. And I'm like, dang, like, I don't know how to do this. So my battle buddy, right? You got to pick somebody to help you. Lesson 2, pick somebody. If you got to pick somebody to do a task with, pick somebody who knows what they're doing. So the person I picked, she was just as clueless as I was. And so we asked around, and eventually we put our little tent up. But lesson 3, when you put a tent up in the woods, you need to dig a ditch around the tent so that if it rains, you won't get soaked. So we skipped lesson 3, and it happened to rain that night, and we got soaked. And so the moral of that story is, the military is full of new experiences and things that you have to adjust to. And I think that when we start talking about qualities and traits, that's going to play a role in being able to adjust to what's going to be asked of you. I certainly had to do a whole lot of adjusting throughout my career, but it serves you well. So anyway, all right. Now, references and governing policies. AR 40-502 and DAPAM 40-502, they're actually regulations that are come out of Department of Defense instruction and guidance. So each branch of service has, their policy and guidance, but it's really just what the Department of Defense, the guidance that they put out, and then each service may have something else to add to it because it's specific to that particular branch. Okay. So there's chapter 2 that talks about medical readiness, some of the standards, some of the categories, and some of the goals. Chapter 3 talks about profiling, meaning that if you have a medical condition or injury, our system looks at whether it's a physical condition, whether it's upper extremity or lower extremity, whether it's your hearing, your eyesight or vision, or if it's psychological. Okay. So that these kind of things are what governs how we look at being ready medically and physically to do the different things that you're being asked to do. So certain medical conditions, you may need extra levels of care so that you can be medically ready. Let's say maybe you had a sprain or injury. And so it may be important, well, it is important for you to get like the physical care and to get like the regular follow-ups that you need to ensure that your injury heals. Some people will take an injury and from that point on, it continues to give them problems. And so they may get a profile which says, you're not required to do some things that would cause your injury to be worse, but we're not making you leave the military because of this condition, if that makes sense. So that instead we'll put it in your record that there are some things that you can't do physically that would make your condition worse, but you can still do your job. So readiness is important. We'll talk a little bit about DoD Instruction 6130 specifically because that is what addresses psychological or neurological conditions. And then FM 7-22 is our regulation that has been updated that really looks at physical fitness. But what we've done is kind of expanded that to holistic health and fitness, which is called the H2F program. And so if you know anything about the military or have any dealings with the military, that is one of our larger programs that we have been very intentional about building up and building out. Okay. Some other references. AR 40-501 talks about those standards of medical fitness, physical standards for enlistment, appointment, and induction. Now, appointment is when you're appointed to maybe officer ranks as a commissioned officer, or maybe even in a certain field, or if you're inducted into something. And then Chapter 3, again, looks at those standards, but the standards for retention, meaning continuing in service after your first enlistment or your first contract, and also looks at separating from the military, right? Things that medical conditions that you may develop that no longer allow you to serve. Something like permanent loss of sight or significant loss of sight could be one of those kind of conditions. And then, we even talk about retirement. And then Chapter 3-33 talks about learning psychiatric and behavioral health. Again, the governing policy is really out of that Department of Defense instruction. Okay. Now, one of the cool things about the Army is that you can get an assignment almost anywhere in the world. Well, I say the Army, but really the military as a whole, the Coast Guard, the Marines, the Navy, the Air Force, we all have installations that are just in a variety of places. And then, of course, if something is going on in the world, that requires soldiers to be there, that basically can be considered potentially a deployment. And now deployments can also happen anywhere in the world that the Army needs to go to, or any aspect of our military to defend our nation. Okay. So what does that mean for us? Well, so on the one hand, that's pretty cool. You get to travel, right? Maybe you've never been to Russia, but if things got really, really bad and the United States was super involved, then that could be a potential place, right? Africa is another place. I mean, so there's definitely opportunities to see the world, but you may be seeing it, in uniform with an actual job to do. So the concept of holistic health and fitness, I thought I would just kind of introduce you to this. This is something that within our Department of Behavioral Health, we talk about, but it's something that the Army is talking about. And I'm sure all of the other services have something similar. And holistic health and fitness, it just basically looks at fitness from, many, many aspects. So psychological fitness, we consider finance as an area of fitness, but can you consider, like, if you work a job, but you don't get paid, we got a problem, right? I mean, I'm just being honest. So financial fitness becomes so important, how we relate to each other and how we work together as a team, particularly when we're in these different places around the world. And you may be in a place very, very far away from home. How you relate to your team becomes very important. So social fitness, medical and dental, like all of these areas are important. And we basically make sure we get after them under these pillars of readiness. And these pillars are what we call H2F. So there's mental readiness, there's sleep readiness, there's spiritual readiness, physical readiness, and then nutritional readiness. And we talk about readiness because we're always ready. We're always preparing ourselves for having to go to battle, having to deploy. And readiness is all about training. So we train tactically, being able, like I was talking about, being in the woods, what we really call is the field, and being out there, learning how to do your job. That's all about being ready to go somewhere else when, if the need arises, and be able to perform. And so you want to be mentally ready. You want to have your sleep under control so that you're ready in that domain too, in terms of diet and nutrition, physical and spiritual. So all of those are very important, and we recognize that. And that is we encourage our service members to start looking at themselves holistically. And we, develop and establish our programming in that same vein. Okay, so here's some qualities that thrive. All right, being a hard worker, that'll get you somewhere in the military, right? Being determined, persevering. I told you about how we were out there in the woods and it was raining, soaking wet. My sleeping bag was wet. My socks was wet. You hate when your socks are wet, right? Okay, but being motivated and goal-oriented anyway. Self-control is important. Integrity and honesty will get you very, very far. We used to say integrity is kind of like what you do when nobody else is watching. So it's a very important skill because we're all leaders when it comes to the military, and being able to be responsible and make good decisions that are absolutely affecting yourself and maybe many others is important. So having integrity is one of our highly valued qualities. Being accountable, responsible, adaptable. Again, so that those first couple of times in the field for me, they were really rough, but I had to learn how to adapt and learn how to, live in the woods. Just came with the job. Being resilient and being able to focus and perform under stress. Those are very important. So some of the pros about joining the military. Now, a lot of people join because of the benefits. I will be honest, the military is really good about helping you stabilize and prepare for the future. There's the VA home loan, there's educational benefits. Of course, you have a salary that you can depend on coming, once or twice a month, however you set it up. And then you really get an opportunity to learn some solid job skills. And you can take those skills, build on them, and become an expert at your craft. But you can also take those skills and utilize them in the civilian sector. And that can be very beneficial. And then we talked about travel, right? Being able to go places within the nation, North America, South America, internationally, right? And then there's these opportunities. Now, opportunities like that are specialized training, or opportunities that help you, do some fun or cool stuff. Like some people like jumping out of planes, right? Like airborne. Now, I'm not airborne. I'm okay. Like if you tell me I'll have no choice but to jump out of a plane, then I guess that's what I got to do. But if I got a choice, then I'll let, somebody else who's excited about that kind of stuff do it. Air assault is also pretty cool. I have a good friend who finished air assault school, and she talks about how they were rappelling from a helicopter, like in midair. I'm like, I'd rather just stay on the ground. But I love the fact that there's people out there who's willing to do that. So opportunities like that exist. Special forces, intelligence community, people like that kind of stuff. And then even if you speak more than one language, that skill is absolutely valued in the military. Another pro is that it's a very structured environment. And when you have structure, you do learn discipline, and you learn how to make good decisions, manage time, space, be organized, be a leader. You learn how to be a leader. You get to join a team and have people close to you that are relatable, who have similar interests. And then, of course, there's opportunities to advance your career. And you will get opportunities potentially for some very, very unique missions. All right. So those are the pros. Now let's talk about the cons. Ironically, a lot of the cons are very, very similar to the pros, right? So those benefits, if you're not being responsible and handling them, right? Like for education benefits, you get funding for your education and you don't complete the course, or you got to pay that money back. If you don't get a passing grade, you got to pay the money back. If you're not taking care of those VA home loans, that home could definitely be repossessed. So those are potentially, the down, kind of like the downside of having those kind of nice benefits. Travel may not be an option. So it might be absolutely required or mandatory. So, you might be looking at a map and trying to pick where you would like to go. And the military is like, oh, we need you on the other side of the world, in such and such time. So that's also can be a con. These type of trainings, although they're thrill seeking and exciting, they could be really stressful because there's going to be tests and standards that you have to kind of navigate and uphold to complete those courses or to do those jobs. It's going to require hard work, some endurance, and you to manage that stress. And then in a structured and disciplined environment, sometimes that's hard to adjust to if you haven't had, those type of requirements on you. If nobody's, created a structured environment where things are predictable and they happen at a certain time in a certain way, that may be difficult to adjust to. Being able to organize, manage your time, and have leadership skills, it does require you to be able to plan and problem solve and maybe strategize. And it requires you to stay on task. And sometimes, staying on task might be hard to do if you got a lot on your plate or if you're easily distracted. And then sometimes, although we like teams and close-knit groups, it doesn't mean that they like us. And so not being accepted, or experiencing rejection is There's the potential for that in a military environment. Now, does that last forever? No, but you may experience that when you're like new to an environment, or if, you see things differently and you are very much adamant about, your perspective about things. So just, being aware. And then if you want to advance in your career, whatever it is that you want to do, there's more responsibility and more work required. So being able to appreciate that and kind of adjust to that and go with it. Some of our missions are difficult and long. Sometimes you may have an 18-hour day. You may be required to do a 24-hour shift. Of course, you will get an opportunity to rest, but just understanding that, it could be, draining. And then I think we all are well aware that chronic stress has a tendency to lead to mental health symptoms, right? You deal with a stressful environment for so long, and you probably will develop some form of anxiety. And if you're dealing with anxiety for an extended amount of time, anxiety and depression sometimes are on the same spectrum. So you can go from one end to the other. And sometimes you don't even realize that. All right. So having ADHD in the military environment, what are some of the pros and cons? I'm glad you asked. So for some of the pros is that having a neurodiverse brain means that you can learn extensively, you can retain a lot of information, and you are really good about discussing topics of interest, right? There's a phenomenal level of creativity that comes with a neurodivergent brain. And there's a sense of independence and being autonomous about the neurodiversity that's there. And then a lot of times there is some energy that is really, it's really expressed well in, opportunities that allow us to show our courage, or thrill-seeking opportunities, or even taking risks. There's healthy risk-taking type things that neurodivergent brains are really, really great at. So some of the cons of having a neurodivergent brain may be in the social realm. Some of the aspects of getting along with people and building really good, strong friendships and relationships. It does require some social skills that for some people who deal with ADHD, that is a challenge. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It means that it requires a level of awareness and some willingness to work through it. Managing energy, emotions, and impulsive desires in a neurodivergent brain, those are some challenges. Again, not impossible to manage, but it may require work or resources or additional supports. Of course, you all know about the challenges with focus and concentration, and there is that significant likelihood of co-occurring conditions, whether it's anxiety, whether it's depression. And in all honesty, depending on the level of severity of ADHD that an individual is dealing with, medication may just be something that is just an absolute need in order to manage symptoms. So just a little bit more conversation about what the current policy guidance is when it comes to ADHD in the military. DoD Instruction 6130.03, right, came out in 2018, but was updated last year, 16 November 22, okay? And it was actually called Change 4. Now, 6.28 talks about learning, psychiatric, and behavioral disorders. And it really tells you what is disqualifying for military service. So military applicants with diagnosed ADHD, if they meet any of the following conditions, okay? So it says recommended or prescribed educational plan, IEP 504, or work accommodation after the 14th birthday, all right? History of comorbid mental health disorders, prescribed medication in the previous 24 months, or documentation of adverse academic, occupational, or work performance. Now, if you have a diagnosis of ADHD and none of these things occurred for you, like you didn't have any IEP, you didn't have any comorbid mental health conditions, you were able to navigate the diagnosis without any medication over the last couple of years, no, issues with academic, occupational, work performance, then you wouldn't even need a waiver. You could join and not need anything, right? Because none of these things would apply to you. The whole conversation about a waiver comes in when probably one of these things is applicable. And a lot of times with ADHD, generally, this is kind of common. So losing hope, like, oh my gosh, I can't join. Well, I want to have a conversation about waivers. So I'm going to skip to the next slide, and then I'll talk a little bit more about waivers, but just helping you understand if none of these things apply and you do have ADHD, then you don't need a waiver. If one of these things applies, that's when a waiver has to kind of be the thing that's submitted to determine whether or not you're an exception to the policy, because that's what a waiver is. It's basically saying there should be an exception made because even though one of these things are true about me, here's what else you should take in consideration, right? Like maybe I did have an IEP plan, but I don't need it, or I'm doing extremely, much better, okay? Now, there's an article that's written by a medical doctor. His name is David Sawyers. He's also a major in the Air Force, and along with the help of Zane Q and Leslie Clark, they wrote an article that was published in 2021. They looked at data that came from 2014 to 2018. Now, this article was really interesting because it kind of just highlighted some statistics related to this whole conversation about having a diagnosis of ADHD and being in the military. So what I thought was pretty phenomenal about these authors is that they looked through, several different medical record type systems, like prescription system. They looked at the medical record system to kind of see what diagnoses were being assigned. They looked at the military entrance processing kind of system, like MEPS, or station, I should say. But they looked at the data that was coming out of their medical examinations. They looked at military medical records. They looked at all of these different sources of reliable sources of medical information to give us some numbers regarding like how many people have a diagnosis of ADHD and how many of those people with a diagnosis of ADHD actually got treated with medication, and like at what point in their career did that start happening. So I think I have a slide that highlights that. I'll pull that up in a second. But one of the things that they noted, again, was what the DoD policy in 2018 was saying. Now, if you know anything about DoD policy back in 2010, it used to be, hey, if you hadn't had any medication within the last 12 months of your enlistment, then you could join. And then in 2018, that changed. And it basically said, if you've had accumulation of medication within the last 2 years since age 14, then that would be a reason why you could be disqualified for service. That has changed, right? What I highlighted in 2022 was that it's 24 months. It doesn't say anything about cumulative or anything like that. So there's a little bit more leverage there, okay? And then one of the things that they noted was the Air Force may have a little bit more flexibility. They look at stability for the last 15 months versus 24 months, but I think that is a waiver, okay? And then in 2017, ADHD and disruptive behavior disorders was the 5th most frequent medical disqualification for first-time enlisted active component military applicants. So, so that's just an interesting finding that out of all of the people who were disqualified for medical service, the fifth highest reason was having ADHD or some type of disruptive behavioral disorder. Okay. They had some other findings. Let me see if we have some of that stuff. So here are some of the statistics that I was talking about, the article highlighted. So in 2014, right, we had 58,000 service members who had a diagnosis of ADHD. 58,000, right? That's more people that's hanging out than that's who's hanging out with us for the webinar today, right? That's a lot of people. 58,000 people is a lot of people. In 2018, that number did go from 3.9% of the military force to 2.8. So instead of it being 60, it was close to 40,000. So that's a 20,000 person difference because of the way the rules changed. Okay. So that's really interesting because what it shows is that as the rules that govern what qualifies as a diagnosis, I mean, not what qualifies as a diagnosis, but as the rules govern, what's a disqualifying condition and what is not, that really does change how many people are serving in the military with that condition. So they also saw that, of course, that decrease in soldiers having a diagnosis or military personnel, a lot of it was those people who were first joining E1 through E4. And so in 2018, E1 through E4 is probably the lowest prevalence, meaning the lowest number of soldiers who actually have ADHD. But what was interesting was about 60% of those people from 2014 and 2018 were actually prescribed ADHD medication. 60%. That's more than half. And close to 80% were prescribed stimulants. 16.5 to 17.4 basically had a stimulant as well as a non-stimulant. And then 3.6 to 3.9 had non-stimulant medication. And then they also found out that a lot of those individuals were maybe age 25 or older. Those were the ones that were likely to get medication to manage diagnosis. And just above the enlisted rank of E1 through E4, some of them were dealing with divorce, widowed, or some of them were in the healthcare occupation. And maybe because they were learning more about, access to care, as well as that there is treatment for the diagnosis, and the military will, give treatment. Okay, so I'm going to move a little bit quicker because I'm watching the time and I want to be available to answer questions. So I thought this was interesting. This is one of the tables that came out of another source, an article that came out of U.S. Medicine, and it just showed, from 2006 to 2017, the waivers that were submitted, and then the ones that actually were approved. Okay, so you can see how maybe like in 2006, a little bit, maybe about 450 waivers were submitted, and less than 300 were actually approved. Again, remember, a waiver is because you have a condition and one of those disqualifying factors is true for you. So we're asking you to accept me anyway because I do have one of those things, but here's some additional information that you should know about me, meaning, that I can adjust to this environment, or that I've demonstrated that I do have stability and I can, manage the symptoms, okay? So I'm going to transition a little bit to just highlight a few things that I wanted you to see. So one is the stress continuum, right? So if you know that dealing with ADHD has always been a significant struggle, and you've always need medication. In a military environment, it's stressful. And so if you thought that you probably could escape, not necessarily escape into the military, but join the military, come off the medication, and try to thrive in a stressful environment, chances are probably not. One of those tables kind of showed, maybe I'll go to it real quick, but it kind of just shows attrition, right? The people leaving the military. And so this blue line is people who don't have ADHD that are just in the military. There's always a natural attrition of people leaving the military after their first enlistment or after second enlistment. Now, of course, there's people who stay. But you can see how sharp the attrition rate is if you have ADHD and you really needed the treatment. And then there are some who leave the military as well, and they have the diagnosis, but they never got, significant treatment for it. So what does that mean? So that means if you have the condition and you are dealing with significant symptoms and you just really do need your medication, then this may not be the best environment for you. Just kind of coming in and knowing, right? Until the military kind of changes the policy in terms of not giving people a lot of complexity or restriction around the medication aspect of it, then this might not be a good space. So I wanted to highlight a little bit more that stress continuum, what it looks like. When you're barely surviving or you're struggling or in crisis, that heightens the likelihood of some type of anxiety or depression developing. And as you can see, as I told you earlier, there is depression and anxiety are on a continuum. Okay, so you can certainly expect, if you're dealing with depression for an extended amount of time, that it will look like anxiety and vice versa. And again, just knowing that there is a lot of overlap between depression, anxiety, and even traumatic experiences that have not been resolved. Trauma symptoms kind of get mixed in that whole flavor. So what we want to do, we want to make sure that if you're dealing with ADHD, that you're getting the proper treatment for it. Now, of course, medication is one treatment, but you could also look at therapy or even a coach, and they could help develop certain skills to help manage the symptoms where medication may not be needed. And it just because of having ADHD, sometimes there has been some traumatic experiences that haven't been worked through, or in a military environment, the things that you may be exposed to on a deployment. And I mean, when you go to war, it's war. So you may see some things, you may be required to respond to some certain situations. There is definitely the threat of danger or harm. And, a lot of our soldiers have came into contact with actual threats, actual harm. And it does kind of take a toll, either being repeatedly exposed to it or just seeing some things that your brain just cannot reconcile all by itself. It could absolutely render trauma symptoms that end up further maybe potentially developing into PTSD. So those are things to strongly consider as you're navigating ADHD in the first place, regardless if you do join the military or not. Just really being able to understand what symptoms are you really dealing with, and then getting the care that you need. You always want to get the care that you need. So I'm just going to highlight a couple more things, and then we're going to go to questions. So one thing I want to encourage people out there is learning how to manage adversity. Now, we always talk about resilience, but at the end of the day, resilience is all about navigating adversity. Adversity is what actually brings out the resilience. So humility, mindset, being a problem solver versus somebody who's a catastrophic thinker. Okay, that's really important. No matter what the environment is, having a vision or dream or end state, using resources, accessing your network, and then having determination. You are going to have to put in work no matter what you do. So you might as well build that into your plan. Okay, so I'm going to skip that slide and just talk a little bit about coping strategies. If you kind of just start from the top down and work through the body, you want to manage your frustration and feelings of overwhelm. You can do that with relaxation, deep breathing, self-regulating type activities. You can also do it with things that bring you a sense of joy. Positive self-talk, music, playlists, comedies, all those things are great for helping you cope. These are absolutely tools that I teach my patients who have a diagnosis of ADHD. I introduce them to the feelings wheel, which is a way to identify all these different emotions that you're feeling. We look at the tasks that they are required to do that are uninteresting, and we try to pair them with activities of interest so that you can kind of get through it. Imagination and visualization are great tools to help you focus and concentrate, and learning how to organize and plan. Those are very important skills and absolutely learnable and teachable. And then enhancing executive functioning. Learning how to organize by creating space and a place for all your possessions. That's very important because in the military, you're absolutely required to hold on to a lot of things, and you need to get to whatever it is that you need to get to in a timely and efficient manner. Teaching you how to process your information, thoughts, and feelings that falls in the realm of cognitive behavioral therapy. We do a lot of that. Developing a routine problem-solving method. That is great for just laying a foundation for how you approach difficult challenges or issues, breaking larger tasks or goals into smaller steps. Again, pairing music with different tasks, even with work, will help you get through your day. Keeping situations into perspective so that you can see the big picture, being able to take on other perspectives, and then utilizing practical situations to work through and practice organization and planning. So a practical situation goes a long way for trying to organize and understand and make sense out of a situation that you're dealing with. So here's some more coping skills. I'm moving even quicker. Here's this big conversation about resilience, 6 domains of resilience: vision, composure, reason, health, tenacity, collaboration, and then a few recommendations. All right, so 1, I encourage you to take an honest look at your symptoms and your strengths and how you manage both. I want you to ask, is the military an environment that I could thrive in? You know, given what we talked about, is this an environment that you could thrive in? What coping skills could help you manage your symptoms? Now, I probably talked about 35. I don't know. I did it pretty quickly, but you could take your time to kind of really look at coping skills and executive function strategies to help you manage. What resources are available to you to manage your symptoms? Because at any point, you could start looking at these resources, not just because you're considering a career in the military, but, you know, just using these resources anyway to maximize your ability to manage the diagnosis, okay? Therapy, support groups, you want to develop a plan. So maybe if you've had some medication usage within the last couple of years, or you feel like you still need it, maybe you will look at school or a technical, you know, developing technical skills first. Not to say that you won't ever apply to the military. You can join the military up until the age of 32. So maybe taking that time to really establish your structure and your support and your coping strategies so that if you do apply and you apply for a waiver, you can say, hey, I left high school this year, and over the last 3 years, I've been, you know, working in this field, or I've been, you know, going to this particular school, and I've been able to not need the resources. I've learned other coping techniques to manage. Learning how to demonstrate stability and stress management, and then learning about all the jobs the military has to offer and finding ones that you like, that you absolutely have an interest in, and that would be a good fit for you. And then there are other options to consider. There's Department of Defense, civilians, and contractors as well. So those might be something else that allows you to work alongside the military, not necessarily in the military, where you probably could get the accommodations that you need. So wrapping up, here's my disclaimer again, just to let y'all know, this is my views and my opinion, and they don't reflect the official policy or position of the Army or Department of Defense or the government. Now, what questions do you have?
Thank you so much. Before we start the Q&A, I'd like to thank Accentrate 110 once more for sponsoring this webinar. I'd also like to share the results from today's poll question: what aspects of military life are most appealing to you or your child with ADHD? Here are the top answers. 18% said structured, routine, and clear expectations. 17% said opportunities for skill development and career advancement. And about 11% each said personal growth and self-discipline, emphasis on fitness and engagement, sense of purpose, and disciplined approach on tasks and responsibilities. Okay, so now to your questions. My 17-year-old son is a junior in high school. He's been interviewed by a National Guard recruiter and wants to stop his ADHD and anxiety meds as soon as possible to meet military requirements. These medications are very important to him to help him finish high school. What is your advice for this situation? And we've had similar versions of this question.
Okay, so my recommendation would be if your son is really adamant about stopping the medication, then let's have a conversation with the doctor, right, his pediatrician or physician, and let's also bring into that conversation, maybe a teacher or somebody who's kind of keeping an eye on them academically, and see if is it possible to titrate off the medication. Because, you can come off the medication and do it kind of slow. Are there supports and other resources and coping strategies that your son could implement as he's titrating off the meds? So the coping skills, compensatory strategies, really working with a therapist or a coach to develop the skills that's needed. Because what you don't want is to come off the medication and then struggle with finishing school and then struggle when you join the military. So part of it is just kind of being able to understand what it really looks like for extended amounts of time not having a medication. You could also consider when he's not in school, like the summer, as an opportunity to really see how well the individual can do without the medication. But again, if you take something out of the picture that's helping, then you definitely want to establish other things that could support and provide what was missing, even if it's not medication. So therapy is a good alternative. Coaching is a good alternative. So it's not a bad thing that they want to stop the medication, but it would be better to do whatever you need to do in a healthy way with the conversation happening.
Is there a high school GPA requirement to enlist? And if so, does it apply to all branches of the military?
So most of the branches of the military require you to pass the ASVAB, or they may have kind of more of a, it may be an updated version and it may have a new name to it, but it's an entrance exam into the military. So that's always there. Some of the branches may allow you to join with a high school diploma, not necessarily concerned about the GPA, but more so just that you complete it. Some of them will allow you to join with a GED. I know the Army allows you to join with a GED, but I don't think the Air Force was allowing it. I think they required a deployment. A deployment. They required a diploma. Sorry.
We had this question: which military roles might be best for a person with ADHD and minor processing delays?
Can you say that one more time? I'm so sorry.
Sure. Which military roles might be best for a person with ADHD and minor processing delays?
It still depends, because there are sedentary jobs, but you may someone with processing speed challenges may do well with things that are much more hands-on. So jobs that allow you to kind of really work with your hands, maybe it's being a mechanic. Those kind of jobs would probably be a little bit more easier to navigate versus a job that requires you to sit, look at a computer, answer all these questions, or do all these reports.
We had this question: do these same rules and regulations apply to other neurodiversity, to other neurodivergent conditions like autism or learning disabilities?
Yeah, so autism, I don't think if you have a diagnosis of autism, and I think having that diagnosis, it may be a disqualifier according to that DODI that I was talking about. And you can Google them and check because it comes right up on the internet. Section 6.28 talks about neurological conditions, psychiatric conditions. So things that are not really that are disqualifying, or it may say you might need a waiver for certain things. But yes, so it even talks about different learning impairments or challenges.
Okay. My daughter is considering joining the ROTC in college to help defray expenses. Would her ADHD diagnosis prevent her from doing so?
So based off of what we talked about, so having ADHD all by itself, no. If one of those different disqualifying aspects, kind of one of those disqualifying conditions apply, then maybe, but it's definitely a conversation to have with a recruiter. I encourage, transparency, with whatever your condition is, but also being okay with developing some type of plan to help, if you want to do more skill building to prepare you for military service. So just kind of having a conversation with a recruiter to see what they have to say. That would be helpful, even for ROTC programming.
So this is an interesting question. Of course, they're all interesting. After you get into the military, is it possible to be treated with ADHD medication? So with this question, I'm assuming they didn't have a diagnosis when they got into the military, or they stopped taking meds, and now they want to know if they can be treated after they've been admitted.
Yeah. So maybe you have some symptoms, but you never kind of get it tested. And then you find out these symptoms are interfering with my job. And so you go ahead and see a medical provider and get a diagnosis. Or maybe you got in on a waiver and it's documented that you had a diagnosis, but your waiver says that for the most part, you're good. And then you start working and you start seeing, okay, some of these symptoms are coming up and they're interfering with my performance. So yes, you can get a diagnosis and get treatment. The Army does. I know I can speak for the Army. I'm not sure about some of the other services, but the Army is kind of strict with giving that diagnosis. You, for the most part, do have to get psychological testing, and we do assessments. And if that is what the outcome of the assessments reflect, then you get a diagnosis and you're not denied treatment. You can get medication. The only thing about medication is that when you're taking a stimulant and you're required, you want to go to certain schools or do certain training or do deployment, then you need a waiver for those type of things potentially as well.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, that has to be our last question. But Dr. Walker, thank you so much for joining us today and for contributing your expertise to our ADHD community. We appreciate that. And thank you to today's listeners. We hope to see you again next week for our free webinar on solutions to identify and prevent teen bullying. Make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you so much.